Happy Monday. Today's May 16th. Thanks so much to folks for coming out today. We're going to be using the Meetup Data Career Pendulum Slack channel. So here is the Slack channel. I just posted it in the chat. Please try to use the Slack channel and not the Zoom chat. Someday I'll figure out how to turn it off, but until then. Today's panel, we have three really exciting guests to talk about their transitions from data ICs into management roles, back to IC roles, and then in Lindsay's case, back into management. So I'm really excited to dive into this with our panel today. For folks who are joining, please make sure you're on mute if you're not talking. Otherwise, let's go ahead and ask our panelists to introduce themselves. So Erika, you're the first on my screen. Why don't you tell us your name, where you work, and where you're based out of? And then we'll go Caitlin and Lindsay, and then we'll do a little bit more in depth around career paths.
Okay, sure. So, hey everyone, I'm Erika. I work for Hex, and I am based in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Caitlin.
I'm Caitlin Hudon. I'm based in Austin, Texas, and I work at OnlineMedEd.
And Lindsay.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm Lindsay. I'm based in the Bay, living in Berkeley, and I am the founder, CEO of a company called Iggy.
All right, let's go in reverse order. I'd love to hear, I gave a little bit of a teaser there around your careers being IC to management to IC and then maybe back to management, but can you tell the audience and myself a little bit about how you got into data, when you moved into management, and then when you moved, how long were you in IC, when did you move out of management, and a little bit there, just so we're all starting the conversation from the same page. Lindsay, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to keep this brief. So high level, I was finishing a PhD in government politics when I transitioned into data science. So I did this thing called Insight Data Science. Happy to talk more about that, but it no longer exists, but helped, essentially was like almost too good to be true in the best of ways, in that they helped PhDs, particularly quant PhDs, transition into careers in data science. So 2014, I applied to that. I got in. I ended up at Airbnb. It was just wild and changed my life in so many ways. So my first role at Airbnb, I was, an IC. Had a lot of learning to do. So was in that role for about 2 years before I got my first promotion into becoming a manager. So Airbnb, most of you I'm sure know it, two-sided marketplace, guest side, host side. The data science team, when I joined, you chose one or the other, the guest side or the host side. The guest side was much more developed in terms of the data science teams. I worked a lot on experimentation. We were launching our internal experimentation framework. Che, one of the developers of it, now has his own company. A lot of it came out of his lessons at Airbnb, but in any case, worked a lot on experimentation, and I was kind of known as like the experimentation kind of like lead, not in terms of developing the platform, but evangelist in terms of working with product teams and analyzing experiments and doing a lot of feedback onto the platform we had. Yeah, I got promoted to become a manager and managed a couple of teams. Just for context, when I was hired at Airbnb, I was like the 27th data scientist. That was 2014. By the time I left in 2020, it was like 175. So like lots of growth, not just obviously in terms of the team size, but also the experimentation. And so, yeah, I managed for a bit. I really liked it, but didn't like one of my managers. And it turns out a lot of people at Airbnb were going through this. And I'm mentioning this because I think it has lots of implications for being like a more senior IC, kind of in an attempt to appease those of us who were like quite unhappy in our roles, but like relatively senior. the data science leadership came up with this idea of like, oh, you guys can just be ICs like again. And we didn't, promotions went through management roles, right? Like you didn't, there really weren't senior ICs at Airbnb around the time. This was like let's see, I started in 2014, 2015, got promoted in 2017. I think it was 2018, 2019 when I went back to being an IC. But they were just like, you're an IC, you're a tech lead. And like no one knew what it meant. I can talk more about that, but to close this out, as you can imagine, being in a role that like no one knew how to define it, like what was a senior IC, what was a tech lead, like people didn't report to me, but I was advising them on their projects. These are more junior people. It was an absolute mess. And for that and many other reasons, I decided to leave and start my own company, obviously, which meant that I was no longer an IC. So I put a lot out there. Someone else should go now.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It sounds like it's not just about transitioning from IC to management or back and forth, but also about an alignment and understanding about what those roles mean within your org. And that was a driver for you. Caitlin, tell us about your journey.
Yeah, I really like hearing your journey, Lindsay, especially going back and forth and then back again. So I'm excited to hear more. That wasn't too much. So I've been in data since 2011. I graduated with an undergrad degree in stats, and I thought I was going to be an actuary. And so I started studying for the exams after college. I took a year off and rolled burritos and was a ski bum, had a really good time while I was studying for my exams. And then this job opened up as a statistical analyst. And it was for an analytics, predictive analytics software company that also had a real focus on data cleanliness, data blending, that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I sort of fell into data. I basically realized that you could do my favorite part, which was predictive analytics, and not just for insurance companies. And that was mind blowing for me. And so I've been in the field ever since. And I've worked at a bunch of different companies doing a bunch of different things. So I've worked with data from colleges and universities, data from nonprofits, data for businesses. And so within businesses, I've worked with marketing teams and product teams and data teams and algorithm teams. And so lots of different stuff within data, and largely with startups. So I kind of started at a really small company. The predictive analytics company was pretty small. And then I went to a mid-sized company for a while and wasn't having the kind of impact that I was used to having. And so I transitioned back into startups about 4 years ago. Yeah, 4 years ago. And so I joined OnlineMedEd almost 4 years ago as their first data person. And at that point, so our CEO is a former epidemiologist, and he has a really good handle on data. He loves data, he trusts data. So there's a lot of buy-in at the top level, which is great. And so he was looking for someone to take the data that they have and just kind of run with it. And so since I've been there, we've built out the team that I helped to start. And so we have a data analytics group. That group is up to about a dozen people. And so that's gone through many iterations, I guess, since I've been there. And so when I started, I was a senior level IC. And then as we grew the team, it made sense for me to manage the folks who were on the team. They were both new to data. I sort of had an idea of what we wanted to build and where we wanted to go. And so I was doing both technical leadership and people leadership. And I learned a lot of lessons about doing those two things at the same time and the push and pull that there is there. As we grew more, it made sense to build things like a data warehouse and start to build some BI reporting. And I love data quality. I love using data in terms of doing data science, but that really wasn't where my heart was or where my background was. And so I thought it made more sense for someone else to come in and grow that part of the team. And so I kind of had this path where I could have stayed on in a leadership management capacity there and grew that team a little bit further. Or I could go back into the data science side and kind of do the same thing over there. And so I chose to go back to an IC role in data science. And that's where I've been since then.
Thank you, Caitlin. Always a good reminder of how much buy-in at the top level of an org really matters as you're building and growing a data team. Erika, take us away.
Yeah, sure. And actually, there's a fun connection. I connected to Caitlin back when she made her transition into management when I was still a manager to kind of like talk shop. And managing is definitely a really challenging role in a lot of ways, and you don't get there without friends and people to help you. So I did not actually start my career in data. I started in manufacturing operations. I worked for a flooring company. I was a process engineer for a while. My job was to make it better, faster, cheaper yesterday. And that's how I entered into management, was actually running a 24/7 manufacturing facility with 4 shifts, 40 associates. And it's a really different kind of management than doing management of people who are doing like data type things. Like a lot of the roles are very defined, but you can still create this culture of like good teamwork and collaboration and empowerment for the folks that are working on your team, even though the mission is make more for cheaper, faster yesterday with higher quality. It's like very set. While I was doing that work, I had developed this kind of passion for data and analytics that led into stepping out of manufacturing and into a full-time role leading a data team that focused on the manufacturing space. I did really well with that. And so I got moved up into this role over a team of about 12. So I had 6 different domains of the company that I was responsible for, 12 analysts. They didn't all report to me, but I did really have too many direct reports, I can see now. And some of the analysts were reporting to these dotted line managers, which meant I had to go like negotiate with those managers to get stuff done. And the pandemic hit while I was in that role, caused massive supply chain disruptions that are still ongoing. And it was just like a really challenging situation to lead in. I think we did a really good job as a team. We doubled our delivery velocity of analytics in the time that I led the team. We successfully onboarded a lot of people, but I was reaching this point where I had done the things I could do with that team to make it really hum and click and grow. And organizationally, I was blocked on technology changes, kind of people and HR related changes, like making things better was becoming less and less of an option. And there's this kind of like immovable object of the organization around me. And I recognized that it would take many, many years to make the kind of changes I wanted to see. I should also say this is a super legacy company. I always get a laugh when I tell people they literally had a COBOL mainframe in the basement. And so I was kind of missing out on all this. I know Lindsay's shaking her head. I was missing out on all this modern data stack fun. So I decided to take a chance and go back to being an IC for a while, like reconnect to my love of doing the technical. I joined a startup called Ala Education. Kelly's actually on the call. So thanks, Kelly, for taking a chance on someone making a big transition. And that startup, unfortunately, went through a pretty major layoff in November of last year. And that's how I ended up at Hex. I was Hex's first data hire. And so I think that having a manager background really prepares you well for being that team of one kind of person, because you have this skill set of going to talk to other leaders and teams and prioritizing, but you also have the technical skill set needed to do your job well.
Thanks, Erika. I think one thing that I really heard in your discussions, like there's a lot more kinds of management beyond people management. And I think it's really easy for us to lose sight of like there is people management we do that isn't related to our reporting structure either. So really great there. I'm curious, I'm going to open this up to the panelists, all 1, 2, however many of you can jump in. A lot of people move into management for the first time because they think that's the next logical step in their career. Like they've been doing the thing, they're climbing the ranks, and then they're like, I guess I'm going to lead this team. How did you see it that way? And then when you made the transition from that management role into an IC role, did you see it? Did you move into a lateral role, a step back role? How did you see it? How do other people see it? What's the feedback you've heard there? And like I said, open to the panelists.
I didn't see it as necessarily a step up. in terms of like a career ladder. And so we were pretty lucky in terms of our leadership had built out an IC ladder and a management ladder and had roles that corresponded within those. And so you didn't have to move into management in order to move up, which I think is a thing that happens sometimes at companies. And so that's something earlier in my career, when I was interviewing, that's kind of the question that I should have asked maybe, like, what are the paths available to move up? And at what point does the technical role get absorbed into a more leadership or management focused role? And so for me, I moved up into that role. I was about the same level wise. And then I stayed in that role. I had impact in that role and through the IC work that I was doing. And so I moved, when I went back into an IC role, I moved up a level in the IC role. And that just worked out because of the relationships that I had built over time at my company. I'd been at my company for a while. I really knew our systems and our people and how to make things happen. And so that was really helpful on both sides, the management side, working with the people, of course, and the project management side, knowing what projects were going on and how those were flowing, and then the technical side, of course.
Yeah, I think for me, there's definitely a phase early in my career where like moving that ladder step up felt like success. And therefore it was like something that I wanted to attain. And that was very much a part of the organizational culture where I was as well. There wasn't really this concept of a parallel ladder for ICs and managers. It was like, first you're this and then you're that. The second title is manager. But a lot of the times when I've changed, I've actually changed companies at the same time too. And that's been interesting because, you know, people at Hex know me as like Erika IC. You know, some people might have never known that I managed in the past or that I had a bigger team or that I've done those things in my history. And so it's just kind of an interesting dynamic. Like that doesn't necessarily follow you if you make that transition as part of a change between orgs. But I really think about now I have a different perspective where I'm much more interested in doing interesting and challenging work with awesome people. And I'm much less interested in what the exact title of that work looks like. But I have never taken a pay cut in any of the transitions that I've made back and forth. And so I think that's fairly common if you do end up going back to IC roles. I don't think it's usual to take a pay cut to do that, but I'm sure people have.
I would be curious, Caitlin or Lindsay, if you could speak to the compensation piece at all, share as much as you're comfortable, no pressure. Remember, this is being recorded, but when you made those transitions, you two were within the same company. Is there anything around comp that you are willing to share?
Yeah, you know, so I was at a big company. Airbnb wasn't public when I was there, so I don't know if this has changed. So yeah, well, I had comp increases each time. So when I went into managing, I'm trying to think, I probably got like a 12 or 15% increase in pay. It came with equity increase as well. That I don't know, I deemed not significant, but it probably was in the long run. And then when I went to become an IC, it was the bump wasn't nearly as big. I still got a bump up. I think it was closer to like 5 or 6%. I don't know if there was an equity increase with that. I don't remember, which probably means there wasn't. Yeah, I don't. So I have no idea how common that is. If that was like a big company thing. Yeah.
Remind folks how big Airbnb was when you made that transition.
Yeah. So when I became a manager, wow. Let's see, when I joined, I think we were like 800 people. 2 years later, we had probably at least doubled. And then 2 years after that, yeah, we had doubled. Oh, I don't know if we had doubled again. Maybe growth had slowed down a little bit, but so it was maybe 5,000 people. Yeah.
Caitlin, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, both of my transitions happened at the end of the year, which is also when we do our review cycle. And so everything for me was sort of baked into that. Yeah, and I got a separate bump when I moved from, I think my title was senior data scientist, and I moved to principal and sort of jumped our staff level because of some of the transitions. And so there was a separate bump for that, but that wasn't really tied to the pendulum swing. So yeah, mine was a little bit harder to tease out because it was happening within review season too.
Yeah, that's a great call out. And Erica, I appreciate you bringing that up. Something that came up in the prep for this panel was actually if I'm thinking about it, do I have to prep? If I'm thinking about going from management to IC, do I have to prep for a possible pay cut? So next question actually comes, go ahead, Lindsay.
So sorry, I actually think that there's something really interesting here, and I'm guessing it's quite common too, which is like, okay, Airbnb, big org, and like there were tons of resources for becoming a manager. Like you became a manager and you like automatically got access to all this stuff, like a 6-week course with a mentor on how to manage teams, or like, how to do performance reviews in a way that weren't biased. Like they were so clear about like, this is a step up on the ladder, and we're so proud of you and we want to support you in like all of these new things. There's nothing similar for IC transitions. Like, and it's so frustrating, right? Because it's like, obviously people management is very difficult, and it's not just people, it's stakeholder management. But I think there's something there in that there is just sort of this assumption with the IC work that like, oh, well, you're doing this thing and you're pretty good at it, so keep being good at it because you've got something figured out, right? Like there wasn't support in terms of like we started some of these things, but like, oh, you want to get better at this analysis, right? Or like you want to get better at experimentation. Those were very informal kind of discussions, programs, network-based things. And so I don't know, there's like there's probably something bigger there, right? In terms of like even I was a part of the team that like that tried to like, how do we write like evaluation criteria for ICs, right? It's sort of like, oh, you know it when you see it. Like, no, that's not good enough, right? And I think that maps on to some of this like these experiences around like sometimes, oh, you don't get a pay increase or you don't get a promotion because like the whole system is just rooted, the whole system, it sounds weird, it's not doesn't have to be organized, but like, it's based in this understanding of how you develop in your careers. And I think like sadly we like, I don't know, we haven't done a good job on the parallel track there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And having like had both kinds of conversations, like the management ones, I think tended to be more group conversations. Like that's how I originally got pretty involved in LO, is like participating on there. And the work of managing is so much easier to compare without getting so specific, versus like I had a conversation this week about some details related to our segment implementation with someone that Emily connected me to, and I like showed this person our numbers. Hey, here's where we're at. They're like, wow, yeah, that seems high. I agree. But you don't want to put that kind of content into the public world, or even something much more sensitive and less standard, or maybe something that your competitors would find interesting. So because that IC work is so much more specific in some ways, it's hard to have a meaningful connection or conversation. And I think in a way, ICs tend to be isolated from that font of good practice that managers have access to. Although I would say that managing itself can be pretty isolating in some senses if you don't take care to maintain a good group around you to have good support as a manager.
I've been really happy to see the resources around like staff level engineering start to come online more over the past couple of years. That's a trend that I've been noticing. And exactly to your point, Erica, I think it's hard to compare individual projects because when you're doing projects, you're so deep in the nitty gritty technical details that are so unique to each company, each organization, implementation, culture. And so trying to have those conversations and also respect IP and all of that stuff can be really hard in a way that management didn't strike me as having those same sort of limitations. Like there were a lot more broad strokes that you could paint in, whereas it's a little bit harder to get to the meat of an issue without really getting into the nitty gritty on the IC side.
This is awesome. I want to pass over to Katie. Katie's got a question and Katie's going to come off mute and ask it herself. Katie, take us away.
Hi, I'm Katie. Thank you for hosting this panel today. My question is about that swing from being a manager and coming back to IC. I'm curious if your interest in getting back into the technical work kind of played a role in moving back into an IC position. I'm finding that as a manager, I have to forego a lot of the technical, and I'm doing a lot of the like double checking and like hand holding of my supporting team members. And I love that teaching aspect, but I kind of miss getting my hands dirty. And I'm just curious how that may or may not have played into moving back out of management and into IC.
For me, it was huge. It, you know, as you noted, I was managing a team, and like, I think one of the biggest transitions that needs to happen when you're managing a team is you're saying that your leverage is through your reports for the most part, right? It's like that is what it's about, is like empowering, setting them up for success, replicating yourself in a way which isn't like exactly fair, but I think if you're really into technical work, then you like look to do it. So yeah, for me it was like I wasn't ready for that. There was still a lot I wanted to learn and build, and I couldn't do both. I think I was trying to do both for a while, and it was like, and some of that was rooted in this idea of like there's one way to progress in a career, and you become a manager and you build a bigger team, and like then it becomes a fiefdom, you know, and that's kind of messed up. And so I actually had to fight that a lot internally, that sort of idea that like I'm stepping away from leadership, right? Leadership, which is growing a team. So yeah, that played a huge role. But I think it's important to listen to that, because it doesn't go away. Like if that's how your mind works, if that's how you're engaged, then I don't think it's going to be sated. Some people by a side project, but yeah, played a huge role for me.
Yeah, I think for me as a manager, the thing I really miss is helping somebody become the absolute best version of themselves and watching them just like kill it on the biggest stage. Like that to me is way more satisfying than anything I've ever accomplished personally, technically. But the problem is that those things happen very infrequently over the course of a long career, and might take, you know, years of helping somebody develop their skills or change their mindset, or years of making sure they're getting into the right rooms and the right environments to have that kind of success. And so I just found that going back to technical work, it was so much easier to get up from my computer at the end of the day and be like, man, I feel like I got something done. You know, like I think that's the thing in managing, you very rarely get that feeling. And if you're getting it a lot, maybe you're not focused on those things that are truly most important for your team that only you can do as their leader, as their manager, you know, forging like connections and relationships with other organizations and removing obstacles that are bigger than the team. And I think the answer is like, if those things in your organization were easy to fix, they would have been fixed already. And so the fact that that work feels a little bit frustrating at times is just, to me at least, kind of baked into the nature of managing in some ways. So yeah, I definitely missed the technical work when I was managing, and especially when I was in the first data leadership role, I had 3 direct reports and me. So I could still kind of pinch hit here and there and do little stuff and kind of like keep my hand in. And then when I was moved up into the bigger role for the team of 12, it was like, oh no, my job is meetings now. And it turns out pre-COVID, the limitation on meetings was actually conference rooms. And so it wasn't like a lot of meetings. It was like 9-hour days of meetings, and people would book like the 15-minute slots between meetings for like quick chat. And that was just very, very difficult for me, as I'm actually an introvert. So it was challenging.
I think I learned a lot about myself from doing the transition. So I never saw it as permanent when I decided to try my hand at management. Like, that's truly the way I saw it. I'm trying this out and seeing if I like it or not. I actually really did like it. So I know that I'll go back to technical leadership at some point. But I had more that I wanted to accomplish and learn on the IC side. And so making space for that and just sort of knowing in my head, like, I really want to try to get good at this management stuff. I want to learn as much about management as I can. And then I'll shift gears eventually and I'll scratch that itch, was really helpful. And right now I'm doing sort of the opposite thing. Like, I'm interested in leadership, but I'm actively keeping myself on the IC side. And I've instituted like a ban on reading leadership books for this year. And so rather than trying to divide my attention and get better at both tracks, I'm trying to be really intentional about, like, I want to learn X, Y, and Z over the next couple of years. And then it will be okay for me to shift gears back over into something else. And I would never have known that about myself, that was important, or that was a boundary that I needed to set before doing a couple of swings on the pendulum.
Caitlin, what does XYZ look like there? Is it a specific technology or groups of technologies? Like, what, when you think about growing as an IC, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, it's taking on new projects that I haven't done before. So right now I work for a medical education company. And so it's an e-learning platform. There's a lot of things that need to be stood up that have never been stood up for the first time. So there's a lot of opportunity to kind of shape technical direction. Things like experimentation are going to be coming online. And so that's been really cool to dig deep into that area. I've done experimentation at other companies, but never worked on like the platform or shaping what that program could look like. And so that's a really interesting, meaty challenge. Other things like working on models that I've never gotten to build before in other capacities are really interesting to me. And so just sort of looking at like, what could the next couple of years look like? What technologies could we use? I don't have a specific one that I'm looking for here, but more so like there are specific models that I think I could push for and we could be really successful with here. And so I want to be able to do that.
That's awesome. Our next question also comes from an attendee. Sonia, take us away.
Hey, thanks so much for this panel. This is resonating with me a lot right now. I manage a team, and it's been one of the things I've been from a management perspective. One thing I've always struggled with is like also when I think generally in the industry, if you have less than 4 or 5 people, there's an expectation to IC also while you manage. And I've just found that to really be a struggle, because it feels like either way I don't always show up to either management or to IC when I'm doing both. So this is something I've been thinking a lot more about, is just transitioning more into an IC role, so I'm less of having to make some of those split decisions. But I was just curious, like when you and maybe this is more for Erika or Lindsay, when you were going through the interview process, like were there questions that you specifically like asked, like, do you have IC roles supported? Like, how do you know what your ladder is going to look like? And then also, how do you just handle questions of people, asking, why do you want to make the switch from management to IC? Because it's usually people usually want to make the opposite switch. So it's more of I'd say like a non-traditional switch that people make.
Yeah, I know for me, like I had a really compelling reason, like the COBOL mainframe in the basement and like the bad technology. And like, it was really clear that I wasn't going to be able to learn the kind of things that were part of the modern data stack in the role where I was. So I had like all this data experience, but it wasn't with these really specific tools. And so that compelling why really helped. And I think also like most people who manage who were ICs at one point will get it when you say, I miss the technical stuff. I have this skill or that skill that I want to deepen, kind of like Caitlin was saying. I think if you have a clear and compelling why that's authentic to you, then most people will understand that, even though it's definitely not, I would say, the norm to be making this switch back. I hope it becomes more of the norm. I'm kind of like Caitlin, like I haven't written off managing entirely. I'm having a ton of fun doing what I'm doing right now and being really excellent at what I'm doing right now, but I haven't ruled out that I'll want to go back to leading a team someday, maybe when life is looking a little different than it does for me today.
Yeah, just to second that, like I think leading with it is so important. Like as someone who hires, just have a startup, it's like the toughest experiences are when there's like misalignments due to, misalignments with expectations, like, and that's from the job seeker or the job offerer, right? Like, so from my perspective as like a CEO, someone who hires all the time, it's like, you want to get as much signal as possible from the candidate, like from me in terms of the job posting that I write, and from the candidate in terms of what they're looking for, because to my mind, it's like, sometimes being a CEO, you just try to convince people of things all the time. It's like your job, you tell stories and you convince them of things that you believe about the world. And so there's always like a little, if there's like a super good candidate that is like, hey, I don't want to manage, but like, you might need some, you just need to be clear about it. And so, yeah, that's just how I work it, is like, be as transparent as possible. It can also like cause interesting conversations within an org if someone, like, if you didn't expect something from someone and they're like, hey, this is what's really important to me, like very small team, it's not going to change major things, but at bigger orgs it could mean like, hey, you're not a great fit for this team, but this team over here like totally needs someone like you. So yeah, I again, for me, it's just own it, lean into it, and I think it pays off, because the worst situation, particularly when leaving orgs, is that it doesn't work out. But it's the worst if it doesn't work out because of something that like someone didn't feel comfortable sharing, that is going to come up at some point. So
Yeah, I would also add that if the transition is still pretty new, I would give yourself some time, because learning management is just not something that happens quickly. Like the time scale of success and failure is much longer. One of my regrets from my period of being a new manager is that I didn't ask for more experienced help from more experienced managers sooner. Like I didn't ask for advice early enough and often enough, because I felt like I'm a manager now. I'm supposed to like know how stuff works and make decisions. And it turns out you're a much better manager to your people if you're regularly getting help and support from mentors and folks that have been there before. So I would just say, like, I think the minimum is maybe 18 months to stay in a management role to like truly grok it and like fully let go of the IC version of yourself and try to learn like how you are as a manager. And if at the end of that, like 18 months, you truly are like, nope, this does not make me happy on Tuesday, then okay, I think it's time to start thinking about doing something else.
I want to jump to the next question. We've had a couple more questions come in here. So Emily, not me, DM'd me asking me to read this for her. She asks, for moving externally, how do you think about writing a resume as a manager moving to IC? What constitutes success is so different in those roles. It's hard to balance showing you were good at your current job versus showing your technical skills. So any tactical advice there for Emily?
I can try. I know for me, like I really relied on my network. I think I actually reached out to Caitlin Mormon when I was looking for jobs, and she was the one who put me in touch with Kelly. And so I think more than necessarily the resume itself, like the network and having a presence in the community helped people know more of who I was and how I was thinking. For management, it really helps to have numbers that you can put to stuff. So some sort of objective numerical measurement. Don't just say like I led a team making reports. You can say something like we doubled our delivery velocity over X time period from one thing to something else, so that people can get a sense of your accomplishments within that management role. And if you're not able to kind of put together and sell those kind of numbers based statements of what you're achieving as a manager, then maybe actually think about that in your current role. Like, am I really telling the success story of my team? Am I able to share it outside my team specifically and directly? And then I would also say if there are specific technologies or things that you need to study, finding a way to do that outside your management role might help ease the transition. I definitely did a lot of that when I was preparing to move.
I have a strong opinion here that like GitHub repos, blogs matter a lot, like particularly if you want an IC role, like to the, particularly in this transition, if like you feel like you've been managing and sure there's a set of people skills there, maybe is not as much that you can own, like do a weekend project, do a longer project. Like as someone who hires, it's like, I do not care. It's going to help that you have management skills, but like if I'm hiring you for an IC role and you can share with me something you've worked on, like that's going to make the biggest difference. I think I often say like blog over like straight up GitHub is that communication skills come across, which like as an IC, particularly a senior IC, the technical skills have to be there, but absolutely the communication. And so that it's usually like a fast track to that. So I heavily advocate for that.
Katie has another question. Katie, you want to come off mute?
Yeah, and it actually was just a little bit touched on right there, but I just was curious. I just heard like almost blog over GitHub, but just the interest in if anyone leveraged like building personal portfolios, blogging through GitHub, etc., to really showcase personal projects outside of current management roles to kind of ease the transition or showcase talent technical sets to get back into an IC position.
I haven't done that personally, but it's advice that I give. And so I think it's really helpful if you have projects and things that you can point to and say, here, especially to Lindsay's advice with a blog entry, like that communication of here's the problem I was trying to solve, here's what I considered, here's the solution I came up with, and being able to both explain and kind of sell your reasoning and polish the thing that you've built, I think are all skills that are really helpful for getting hired on the IC side. And of course, the management stuff, you do bring a lot to the table in terms of being able to make impact with relationships. And so anything that you can do to kind of bring that into the more technical realm is really helpful. And I think portfolio projects could be a good way to kind of marry those things.
Yeah, I know for me, in both of my recent hiring processes, stuff I've written has come up, or stuff I've posted online. And specifically in my very recent hiring process, I have like a repo of DBT tips that's in like real bad need of updating since build came out. But people had found it and read it. So even if it's something that you don't think is like super crazy, like DBT tips was just collating useful information from everywhere. I did it as part of my own learning process and shared it. And lots of people found value in it. And it made its way into that interview loop. It was found by my interviewers. So that's super valuable. The other thing I would say is not all hiring managers are like this, but if you write a cover letter, I always read it. And if it is good, it can help you quite a lot when I am hiring. If it is generic, you might as well have not bothered. But I think writing a really good, compelling cover letter about like where you are and where you're trying to go and how that fits, like Lindsay was saying about, I'm hiring you to do IC work. I need you to be good at doing that job. Help answer some of those questions and give the interview team some signal to have confidence that you're going to be able to do the role they're hiring for. The cover letter is another place you can try and do that if one is allowed to be submitted.
Thanks. Kelly's video is off mute, but I do want to read her comment here also for the recording. Kelly writes, as a current manager and frequent hiring manager, I love when an IC candidate has management experience. Even if they never want to go back to management, they have that perspective. They have probably developed some communication, feedback, and leadership skills that are helpful for any role. So something to think about for folks who are considering the transition or just want to keep their options open. I do like to end these panels on time, and we are right at time. So I'm hoping Erika, Caitlin, and Lindsay, the three of you would be willing to give us like rapid fire final thoughts, maybe one sentence takeaway. Caitlin, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Gathering thoughts really quickly. I think be honest with yourself about what you're hoping to get out of each track. If you're considering a transition, consider why you want to make that transition and what things you're looking for in your current role that you're not getting and how you might get those. And thinking creatively about jobs. I think there are ways that on the IC track you can get management or leadership experience without having that title, and that you can show you've had that experience without having that title. And that stuff can make its way into your resume and then into your next role, which is great. And the same goes on the management side. So if you do side projects or portfolio projects, or if you know you're going to want to transition back, just have a plan for how you're going to keep your skills fresh, how you're going to make that transition eventually, and be honest with yourself about kind of where you are, where you need to be as you're applying for roles.
Erika.
Yeah, I would say only you can know your truth, you know? So like a big thing for me when I was like losing the manager title was people are like, "Oh, you're going backwards," you know, but when I first made the transition, I was happier than I'd been in months and months. I would like be excited about going into work and I'd be smiling, you know, going back in the next day. And you really can't buy that kind of like everyday, day in, day out satisfaction. So I would just say listen to that little voice inside you that's telling you what's right for you in this moment, in this time, and don't worry too much about what things look like externally. And I'll share a resource. Charity Majors has a really great article about this, like manager IC pendulum, that has like a whole list of reasons to do it or not do it. That was a really good resource for me when I was in that deciding place.
Last but not least, Lindsay, final thoughts.
Yeah, final thoughts. This is quite opinionated, but so is my personality. We need more, I think, you know, women, people of color, like ICs. Like it's just, if you look at numbers, there aren't, women will more frequently go to management track than they will IC. Lots of reasons, you know, can have whole conversations there. But I don't know. I see too many women like kind of opting out of IC tracks for a variety of reasons. Oftentimes it's that they just don't think they're good enough, and that is completely false. There's, you know, a great set of resources, you know, in this community and many other communities. So yeah, no, my opinion is like, you know, become a senior IC. We need more of them. And you know, the businesses we work for become better, the products we build become better. We need your voices, so just do it.
I appreciate the strong, powerful end there. Thanks so much for attending. We'll post this recording on YouTube. The Slack channel will stay open for a couple of days, but we have plenty of career-oriented channels where we'd love to keep the conversation going. A big special thank you to our panelists. Woo! Thank you very much for spending a little bit of your Monday evening with us. Thanks so much, folks. Have a great Monday.